Good afternoon. This action finalizes the new source performance standards review for bulk gasoline terminals and the technology reviews for the gasoline distribution major and area source rules. This action does not include gasoline stations. The Clean Air Act requires EPA to review and revise as necessary the NSPS at least every 8 years. EPA's review of the bulk gasoline terminals NSPS focused on whether there were any emission reduction techniques that were used in practice that achieved greater emission reductions than those currently required, and whether any of these techniques have become the best system of emission reduction. EPA determined that there are emission reduction techniques used in practice that achieve greater emission reductions than those currently required by the NSPS for bulk gasoline terminals. The Clean Air Act also requires EPA to assess, review, and revise hazardous air pollutants, also called air toxic standards, as necessary, taking into account developments in practices, processes, and control technologies no less often than every 8 years. The technology review of the standards for gasoline distribution facilities identified several developments that would further reduce emissions beyond the original major and area source rules. Gasoline distribution facilities are facilities where gasoline from pipelines, ships, barges, or cargo tanks is loaded into storage tanks. The gasoline remains in storage tanks until it is loaded into cargo tanks to be transported elsewhere. The NSPS for bulk gasoline terminals is in a new subpart in 40 CFR Part 60, Subpart XXa. The Gasoline Distribution National Emission Standards for Hazardous Air Pollutants, NSBEAP, are in 40 CFR Part 63, Subpart R for major sources, and in Subpart 6B for area sources. Facilities that emit more than 10 tons a year of a single air toxic or 25 tons a year of a combination of air toxics are considered major sources. Area sources are facilities that emit below these amounts. The bulk gasoline terminal NSPS affects facilities that commence construction, reconstruction, or modification after June 10, 2022. Subpart XXa lowers the loading rack emission limits, strengthens cargo tank vapor tightness requirements, and requires quarterly instrument monitoring for equipment leaks. The gasoline distribution major source rule strengthens cargo tank vapor tightness requirements, requires additional storage tank controls, and requires semi-annual instrument monitoring for equipment leaks. The gasoline distribution area source rule lowers loading rack emission limits at large bulk gasoline terminals, adds vapor balancing requirements for bulk gasoline plants, strengthens cargo tank vapor tightness requirements, requires additional storage tank controls, and requires annual instrument monitoring for equipment leaks. The rules also finalized monitoring and operating requirements for control devices, including associated record-keeping and reporting requirements, and electronic submission of reports, removal of startup, shutdown, and malfunction exemptions, and require that the standards always apply, and finalized other minor technical improvements. There are approximately 210 major source gasoline distribution facilities subject to the major source rule and over 9,000 area source gasoline distribution facilities subject to the area source rule. The EPA estimates that this final action will reduce hazardous air pollutant emissions by 2,200 tons per year and volatile organic compounds emissions by 45,000 tons per year at gasoline distribution facilities. The major and area source rule amendments go into effect upon an affected source's initial startup or within 3 years from promulgation, whichever is later, and the NSPS go into effect upon startup of the new, reconstructed, or modified facility, or the effective date of the final rule, whichever is later. Additional information on the final rules is at EPA's Gasoline Distribution MACT and GACT National Emission Standards webpage. If there are any questions, I can take them at this time.
So, Jennifer, with respect to the NSPS 6A, if you could refresh my memory, what is the compliance date for that? Of which
For XXa,
A?
for the NSPS,
Yes.
it would, so the compliance date would be 60 days from the effective date.
Oh, okay. So it's
Oh,
not.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry, not 60 days from the effective date. It is the effective date for
okay.
facilities that constructed, reconstructed, or modified after the proposal date, which was June 2022.
Okay. So they would already be subject to that. Any questions from our audience? Jennifer, you mentioned, if I recollect, there were some changes, I guess, where reductions for the NSPS were realized. I don't know if you could summarize what those changes are as far as those reductions, like some new control technology.
So the loading rack standards were lowered this would be based on the current standard in XX. So for new and the reconstructed modified, there are loading rack standards that were lowered compared to the XX.
Okay.
And then also for cargo tanks, there are vapor tightness requirements, and those levels were also lowered.
With cargo tanks, forgive me for my ignorance, that deals with ships or boats.
It would be more like rail car or the like tank trucks.
Okay,
Are
thank
also
you. And then with the Subpart R and 6B, were those a similar loading rack standards were reduced and vapor leak checks required on that?
Yes, and then I also want to mention one additional item that did change also in the NSPS is the requirement for instrument monitoring. And for the instrument monitoring in the NSPS, that is to be conducted quarterly. And then in the major source rule, the cargo tank vapor tightness requirements were strengthened. And then in the NSBEAP, so both the major source and the area source, there are additional storage tank controls.
Okay.
And then instrument monitoring is semi-annual for the major source rule and annual for the area source rule. And then in the area source rule for the loading racks, there's several different facility types. And for the large bulk gasoline terminals, those limits were lowered. And then for bulk gasoline plants, vapor balancing requirements were added.
Okay, thank you very much, Jennifer.